The morning sun shone brightly over London, casting long shadows across the historic grounds of Buckingham Palace. It was the kind of perfect spring day that brought tourists out in droves, their cameras ready and their eyes wide with anticipation. Among them was Thomas Wilson, a stocky man with thinning brown hair and a red face that suggested he enjoyed his pints a bit too regularly. Thomas had been planning this London trip for nearly a year. A factory supervisor from Manchester, he had saved up his holiday time and convinced his mates that London was worth the expense. "You've got to see the changing of the guard," his neighbor had told him. "It's proper British, that is." Now standing among the crowd pressed against the palace gates, Thomas felt a strange mix of excitement and disappointment. The trip so far had been a series of small frustrations. The hotel room smaller than advertised, the prices higher than expected, and the locals less friendly than he'd hoped. He'd started drinking earlier than usual that day, beginning with a proper English breakfast that included a pint, followed by 2 more at a pub lunch near Westminster. "Bit of a waste of time, innit?" he said loudly to no one in particular, as he watched the guards standing motionless in their ceremonial positions. Just blokes in silly hats standing there like statues. A few tourists nearby glanced at him with disapproval, then shifted away slightly. The royal guards, with their famous red coats and tall bearskin hats, remained perfectly still despite the noise of the crowd. They were an iconic sight, their tradition dating back centuries. Most visitors understood the solemnity and discipline required to maintain such perfect stillness for hours, regardless of weather or distractions. One guard stood particularly straight, positioned closest to where Thomas had pushed his way forward. Sergeant Daniel Okonkwo had served in the Queen's Guard for 7 years, following 2 distinguished tours in Afghanistan. His path to this prestigious position had been challenging. Born to Nigerian immigrants in South London, he joined the army at 18, determined to serve the country he called home. Through exceptional discipline and dedication, he had earned his place in one of the most elite units in the British military. None of this was visible to Thomas, who saw only a black man in a ceremonial uniform. The alcohol had loosened his tongue and blurred his judgment. He nudged his friend Brian and nodded toward Sergeant Okonkwo. "Bet he wishes he was back in Africa instead of wearing that silly outfit," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the momentary lull of the crowd noise. Brian looked uncomfortable. "Come off it, mate. Let's just watch and move on. Wanted to see Big Ben next, remember?" But Thomas was on a roll now, emboldened by the alcohol and the feeling that he was somehow the clever one, seeing through the pomp and ceremony that impressed the other tourists. He stepped closer to the rope barrier just a few feet from Sergeant Okonkwo. "Oi, mate," he called out. Several nearby tourists turned to look, their expressions a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. A young couple from Japan quickly moved away, the woman whispering behind her hand to her partner. Sergeant Okonkwo remained perfectly still, eyes forward, not a muscle in his face twitching despite being well within earshot of Thomas's increasingly loud voice. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Thomas continued, waving his hand in front of his own face. "Can you even see me through all that fur on your head?" An American family with 2 young children looked horrified. The father put his hands over his son's ears and gave Thomas a disgusted look before hurrying his family away from the scene. A group of Italian tourists began recording with their phones, sensing that something unusual was happening. Brian grabbed Thomas's arm. "That's enough. You're making a scene. These guards don't react to anything. It's their job." Thomas shook him off. "That's what I want to see. They say these guards never move, right? Like they're not even human." He laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the respectful murmur of the crowd. An elderly woman with a London accent spoke up from behind them. "Young man, show some respect. These men are soldiers who have served our country." Thomas turned to her with a sneer. "Did I ask for your opinion, Grandma? I'm just having a bit of fun." The crowd had thinned around them now, creating a small open space that only highlighted Thomas's behavior. Several people were openly filming with their phones. A palace security officer in a dark suit had noticed the disturbance and was speaking quietly into his radio while watching from a distance. Thomas turned back to Sergeant Okonkwo and took another step closer to the rope barrier. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his posture perfect, his white-gloved hands gripping his rifle in the precise ceremonial position. "Must be hot under there," Thomas said, sweat visible on his own forehead despite the mild spring air. "Bet they didn't have fancy hats like that where you come from." Brian made one more attempt to pull his friend away. Thomas, that's racist. Stop it right now or I'm leaving without you. Thomas shrugged him off again. It's not racist if it's true, is it? His voice had grown louder and several people gasped at his words. A young woman with curly red hair and an Irish accent stepped forward. That's exactly what makes it racist, you ignorant man. You're embarrassing yourself in our country. Thomas's face grew redder, both from the alcohol and the public criticism. Instead of backing down, he doubled down the way insecure men often do when challenged. I paid good money to visit this place, he said, gesturing wildly at the palace. And they put this one front and center? Trying to be all modern and inclusive, are they? The security officer was moving toward them now, speaking more urgently into his radio. Two police officers who had been stationed nearby also began walking in their direction, having noticed the disturbance. Sergeant Okonkwo remained absolutely still, a testament to the incredible discipline that the Queen's Guard was famous for. His eyes didn't flicker, his expression didn't change, though behind the practiced stillness his mind was active. He had faced racism before, in school, occasionally in the army, and sometimes while in uniform. The Guard's training was rigorous specifically to prepare them for all types of public interactions without breaking character. Thomas, now the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, seemed to feed off the negative energy. He pulled out his phone and held it up for a selfie, his back to Sergeant Okonkwo. Smile for the camera, he said mockingly over his shoulder, knowing full well the Guard couldn't respond. Oh wait, can barely see you against that dark background, can I? There was an audible collective intake of breath from those close enough to hear. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Get him out of here!" Others nodded in agreement. The police officers were only about 20 feet away now, moving with increased purpose as they heard Thomas's words. Brian finally had enough and stepped away from his friend. I don't know you right now, Thomas. This isn't you. He walked several paces back, clearly wanting to disassociate himself from what was happening. Thomas barely seemed to notice, caught up in his own moment of misguided rebellion. Perhaps it was the accumulated frustrations of his life, the job that didn't appreciate him, the rising cost that kept his dreams just out of reach, or the feeling that the world was changing in ways he couldn't control. Whatever the reason, he had chosen this moment, this person, to vent his bitterness. They'll let anyone wear the uniform these days, won't they? He said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Then, dropping his voice slightly but still clearly audible to those closest, he uttered a racial slur that made several people nearby gasp in shock. Time seemed to freeze. The crowd went completely silent. The police officers quickened their pace. For his part, Sergeant Okonkwo had heard such words before. From school bullies as a child, from a drunk outside a pub when he was a teenager, even on one terrible occasion, from a superior officer early in his military career, who was later disciplined and transferred. Each time he had handled it differently, sometimes with anger, sometimes with sadness, sometimes by reporting it through proper channels. But never before had he faced such a public challenge while in the ceremonial uniform that represented centuries of British tradition and honor. His training told him to remain still, to let security handle any disturbances, to be the living statue that tourists expected. The police officers were just steps away from Thomas now. In a few seconds they would remove him, the incident would be over, and Sergeant Okonkwo could continue his duty as if nothing had happened. That was the protocol. That was what was expected. And then, in that moment of perfect stillness before the officers arrived, something unexpected happened. Something that would soon be seen by millions around the world. Something that would challenge traditions and expectations in ways no one could have anticipated. Sergeant Daniel Okonkwo, 7-year veteran of the Queen's Guard, decorated military serviceman and British citizen born and raised, made a decision that would change both his life and Thomas Wilson's forever. The crowd held its collective breath. Time seemed to slow down as Sergeant Okonkwo stood perfectly still, the sun glinting off the brass buttons of his red uniform. For nearly 7 years he had maintained the legendary discipline of the Queen's Guard, through rain and shine, through tourist antics and serious incidents. Not once had he broken his stance. Until now. With a deliberate movement that sent a ripple of surprise through the onlookers, Sergeant Okonkwo took one precise step forward. The sound of his boot against the pavement seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Thomas blinked in confusion. This wasn't supposed to happen. Everyone knew these guards didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react. That was the whole point. They were like living statues. His alcohol-clouded mind struggled to process what was happening. "Sir," Sergeant Okonkwo said, his voice clear and measured, carrying easily across the now silent crowd. "I have served this country for 12 years. I was born in South London, trained at Sandhurst, and completed 3 tours in Afghanistan." The crowd remained frozen in disbelief. Many had their phones up, recording what they instantly recognized as an extraordinary breach of protocol, something that simply didn't happen with the Queen's Guard. Sergeant Okonkwo continued, his voice neither angry nor defensive, but dignified and controlled. "I stand here to protect you and everyone else who visits, regardless of what you think of me. That is my duty and my honor." Thomas's face flushed deep red. The sergeant's calm response was so unexpected, so composed, that it cut through his drunken haze more effectively than any angry retort could have. Around them, several people in the crowd began to applaud spontaneously. The police officers who had been approaching Thomas now stood nearby, clearly unsure about how to handle this unprecedented situation. One of them spoke quietly into his radio, presumably reporting the unusual development to his superiors. Thomas began, but the words died in his throat. What could he possibly say in response? The ground beneath him seemed to shift as the reality of what he'd done, and who he'd done it to, began to sink in. A palace official in a dark suit had appeared, and was now standing near Sergeant Okonkwo. His expression unreadable. Protocol had been broken, but under such extraordinary circumstances that no one seemed quite sure what should happen next. Brian, who had stepped away from his friend earlier, now moved completely to the other side of the crowd, his body language making it clear he wanted nothing to do with Thomas. Other tourists were whispering to each other, some pointing at Thomas with undisguised disgust. "The uniform I wear," Sergeant Okonkwo continued, his gaze now directly meeting Thomas's, "has been worn by soldiers of many backgrounds for centuries. We all bleed the same color for this country." An older man in the crowd wearing a veteran's pin on his jacket called out, "Well said, son." Others nodded in agreement and more applause broke out, scattered at first but quickly growing until most of the crowd was clapping. Thomas stood there, swaying slightly, the phone still clutched foolishly in his hand. The selfie he'd planned to take as a joke now seemed like evidence of his disgrace. He lowered the phone slowly, his eyes unable to meet the steady gaze of the soldier before him. The palace official stepped forward and spoke quietly to Sergeant Okonkwo, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before stepping back into his original position. His face resumed its ceremonial impassivity, but something had fundamentally changed. The crowd knew it. The officials knew it, and most of all, Thomas knew it. One of the police officers approached Thomas. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said firmly. "Am I under arrest?" Thomas asked, his voice small and uncertain, so different from his loud taunting of moments before. "We need to have a discussion about your behavior," the officer replied. "Several witnesses have reported verbal abuse and hate speech." As the officer led Thomas away, the crowd parted silently. Some people took photos or continued filming. A woman near the front looked directly at Thomas and said quietly, "Shame on you." The second police officer stayed behind, speaking with witnesses and collecting contact information from those who had been recording. The official-looking man in the dark suit was on his phone, walking quickly toward the palace gates, presumably to report the incident to his superiors. 20 minutes later, Thomas sat in a small room inside a police station near Buckingham Palace. The effects of the alcohol were wearing off, leaving him with a pounding headache and growing sense of dread. The room had a single window with frosted glass, a table, and 3 chairs. A camera in the corner recorded everything. The door opened and a police inspector entered along with the officer who had brought Thomas in. The inspector, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, placed a folder on the table and sat down across from Thomas. "Mr. Wilson," he began, consulting the paperwork in front of him. "I'm Inspector Howard. Do you understand why you're here today?" Thomas nodded miserably. "I need a verbal response for the record, please," Inspector Howard said. "Yes," Thomas mumbled. "It's about what happened at the palace." Indeed. We have multiple witness statements and video recordings of the incident. The inspector's tone was professional rather than judgmental. Before we proceed, I want to inform you that this could potentially be investigated as a hate crime, which carries serious penalties. Thomas's stomach dropped. A hate crime? I didn't think. That much is obvious, the inspector said dryly. Mr. Wilson, your actions today don't exist in isolation. The Queen's Guard are among the most respected military personnel in this country. Sergeant Okonkwo has a distinguished service record, and yet you chose to publicly harass him with racist language while he was performing his duties. Thomas stared at the table, unable to meet the inspector's eyes. I'd like to understand why, Inspector Howard continued, his tone softening slightly. This kind of behavior rarely comes from nowhere. What's going on with you, Mr. Wilson? The unexpected question caught Thomas off guard. He'd been preparing for anger, for accusations, for punishment. The simple human inquiry broke through something inside him. I don't know, he said, his voice catching. Everything's been hard lately. Lost my promotion at work to a younger guy. My wife's talking about separating. Bills keep rising. He looked up, meeting the inspector's eyes briefly before looking away again. But that's no excuse. I know that. No, it's not an excuse, the inspector agreed. But context matters. We're trying to understand the whole picture. There was a knock at the door, and another officer entered, handing a tablet to Inspector Howard. The inspector studied the screen for a moment, his eyebrows rising slightly. Well, Mr. Wilson, it appears your actions have attracted quite a bit of attention. The videos of the incident are already circulating online. One has over 10,000 views just in the past hour. Thomas groaned and put his head in his hands. My life is over, he murmured. That's a bit dramatic, Inspector Howard said. But there will certainly be consequences. He scrolled through something on the tablet. There's also considerable public interest in Sergeant Okonkwo's response. People are calling it a masterclass in dignity and the perfect way to stand up to racism. Thomas looked up, surprised. He could have yelled at me. Should have, probably. And yet he didn't, the inspector noted. That speaks to his character, doesn't it? Thomas nodded slowly. I made assumptions about him, about where he came from, who he was, and I was completely wrong. Outside the police station, a very different scene was unfolding. Sergeant Okonkwo had been temporarily relieved of his post and brought to the guard room within the palace grounds. His commanding officer, Captain William Reynolds, sat across from him, his expression serious but not severe. You broke protocol, Sergeant, Captain Reynolds said simply. Yes, sir, I did. Sergeant Okonkwo's posture remained straight, his hands resting on his knees. In 12 years, I've never seen a guard step out of position to address a member of the public. The captain continued. There are procedures in place for handling disruptive individuals. The police were already on their way. I understand, sir. Captain Reynolds leaned forward slightly. Why did you do it, Daniel? You've faced hecklers before. Sergeant Okonkwo considered the question carefully before responding. It wasn't about me, sir. It was about the uniform. About what we represent. He paused. If I had remained silent, everyone there would have seen a British soldier being racially abused without consequence. My silence would have suggested that such behavior is acceptable. The captain nodded thoughtfully. The palace officials are in quite a state over this. It's unprecedented. I accept full responsibility for my actions, sir. Captain Reynolds stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds. The thing is, Daniel, we're already getting calls. The Home Secretary phoned personally to express support for you. Several MPs have made statements. And the videos... He turned back to face Sergeant Okonkwo. The public response has been overwhelmingly positive. Sergeant Okonkwo remained silent, his expression giving away nothing. Times change, the captain said quietly. Perhaps our protocols need to evolve as well. He returned to his seat. There will need to be a formal review, of course. But between us, I think you may have done more good than harm today. For the first time since the incident, Sergeant Okonkwo allowed himself a small smile. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Captain Reynolds replied with a hint of a smile. The palace PR team wants to meet with you immediately. This story is already everywhere, and they need to formulate an official response. As he spoke, both their phones buzzed simultaneously with incoming messages. The captain glanced at his screen and raised his eyebrows. Well, he said, showing Sergeant Okonkwo the message. It seems Buckingham Palace has already issued a preliminary statement expressing, full support for the exemplary courage and dignity shown by our service personnel in difficult circumstances. Sergeant Okonkwo stared at the screen in surprise. That was fast. Indeed, Captain Reynolds agreed. It seems you've given us all something to think about, Sergeant. He stood up and extended his hand. And personally, I'm proud to serve with you. As they shook hands, neither man could have predicted just how far the ripples from this incident would spread, or how it would change both their lives in the days and weeks to come. By evening, the videos had spread like wildfire across social media. News vans lined the street near Buckingham Palace, reporters doing live stand-ups with the iconic building in the background. The incident had struck a chord that resonated far beyond London. In a modest flat in Brixton, Sergeant Daniel Okonkwo sat on his sofa, still in his civilian clothes, watching with growing disbelief as his face appeared on the BBC Evening News. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications, messages from fellow soldiers, old school friends, and even people he barely knew. In what many are calling a watershed moment, the news presenter was saying, "A member of the Queen's Guard broke centuries of tradition to respond to racial abuse with remarkable composure and dignity." Daniel's mother called for the third time that evening. He picked up, knowing she wouldn't stop until she reached him. "My son," she said, her voice a mix of pride and worry, the familiar Nigerian lilt more pronounced when she was emotional. "Everyone at church is talking about you. Pastor Williams wants you to come speak to the youth group." "Mom, I'm not sure that's a good idea right now," Daniel replied, rubbing his temples. "The military is still reviewing what happened. I might be in serious trouble." "Trouble? For standing up for yourself with such grace? This country should give you a medal." Despite his stress, Daniel smiled. His mother had always been his fiercest defender. When he'd joined the army at 18, she'd worried endlessly but had supported his decision. Her own journey from Lagos to London in the 1980s had required similar courage. "Let's wait and see what happens," he said gently. "I need to follow the proper procedures now." After promising to visit her on Sunday, Daniel hung up and muted his phone. He needed time to think, to process what had happened and what might come next. His action today hadn't been planned or calculated. It had been a split-second decision based on something deep inside him. A feeling that silence in that moment would have been a kind of betrayal, not just of himself but of everything the uniform stood for. The doorbell rang, startling him from his thoughts. Looking through the peephole, he saw his friend and fellow guard, Robert Chen, standing in the hallway holding a six-pack of beer. Daniel opened the door with a tired smile. "Let me guess, you've come to witness the downfall of my military career firsthand?" Robert grinned and pushed past him into the apartment. "Are you kidding? I've come to celebrate with the most famous soldier in Britain." He set the beer on the coffee table and turned to face Daniel. "Seriously though, how are you holding up?" Daniel shrugged, closing the door and following his friend to the sofa. "Honestly, I have no idea. Everything's happening so fast." Robert handed him a beer. "The lads at the barracks are all talking about it. Most think you did the right thing even if it broke protocol. And the others? There's always going to be a few old-school types who think tradition trumps everything else." Robert took a swig of his beer. "But even they can't argue with the public response. Have you seen the hashtag?" Daniel shook his head. Robert pulled out his phone and showed him. Stand Like the Guard was trending with hundreds of thousands of posts. People were sharing stories of times they'd stood up to racism, or pledging to do so in the future. Daniel's words had been turned into graphics, quotes, even t-shirts already being sold online. "This is crazy," Daniel murmured, scrolling through the posts. "All I did was say what I felt needed to be said." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Robert replied. One person deciding not to stay silent. Across town, in a much less comfortable setting, Thomas Wilson sat alone in a small hotel room. He couldn't face going back to the one he'd shared with Brian, who had sent a text saying he'd found his own room and would be traveling back to Manchester separately. Thomas's phone had been blowing up too, but for very different reasons. His sister had called, furious after recognizing him in the videos now circulating online. His boss had left an ominous voicemail about the company's public image and necessary discussions upon your return, even his drinking. Buddies back home had sent messages ranging from uncomfortable jokes to outright criticism. He sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. How had a holiday turned into this nightmare? The police had released him with a formal caution after several hours of questioning, but they'd made it clear that further action could be taken if Sergeant Okonkwo decided to press charges. The worst part wasn't the potential legal consequences, though. It was seeing himself through other people's eyes, watching the videos and realizing what he looked like, what he sounded like. In his mind, he'd always been the good guy, the regular bloke just trying to get by in a world that seemed increasingly stacked against men like him. But the camera didn't show that guy. It showed someone ugly, someone small, someone he didn't want to be. His phone rang again. This time it was his wife, Louise. He almost didn't answer, but then figured he couldn't possibly make things any worse. "Hey," he said quietly. "I saw the videos, Tom," Louise said, her voice tight with emotion. "Please tell me that wasn't really you." "I wish I could," he replied. "I really messed up, Lou." There was a long silence on the other end. "Then, what happened to you?" "The man I married would never have done something like that." It was a good question, one Thomas had been asking himself for hours. When had bitterness started to eat away at the better parts of him? When had he started looking for someone to blame for his own disappointments? "I don't know," he admitted. "But I hate that guy in the video." "I really do," Louise sighed. "Where are you now?" "Some hotel near Victoria Station." "Brian's gone." "Don't blame him, really." Another pause. "Come home, Tom. We need to talk about a lot of things, but not over the phone." After they hung up, Thomas sat for a long time, staring at nothing. Then he opened his laptop and did something he'd never done before. He searched for information about the Queen's Guard, their training, their history, their role. He read about Sergeant Okonkwo's regiment, about the selection process, about the incredible discipline required. For the first time, he tried to understand the man he had thoughtlessly insulted. The next morning, both men woke to a changed reality. Daniel was summoned to a meeting with senior military officials and palace representatives. He arrived in his full dress uniform, prepared for whatever consequences might come. Instead of the reprimand he expected, he found himself in a room with the general commander of the London district, 2 palace officials and a government representative from the Ministry of Defense. They spent nearly 2 hours discussing not just the incident itself, but its implications, the public response, and how it might shape future protocols. "The traditional response would be to discipline you for breaking protocol," the general said frankly. "But these are not traditional times. Your actions, while unprecedented, demonstrated the very values this institution should stand for." One of the palace officials nodded in agreement. "Her Majesty has been briefed on the situation. She was particularly impressed by your composure and dignity in a difficult moment." Daniel tried to keep his expression neutral, but his surprise must have shown. "Don't look so shocked." "Sergeant," the general said with a hint of a smile, "even centuries-old institutions must evolve. Your actions have given us an opportunity to consider how our traditions can reflect our modern values without losing their essential character." The meeting concluded with an extraordinary decision. Rather than being disciplined, Sergeant Okonkwo would be asked to help develop new guidance for the Queen's Guard on responding to abuse or harassment while on duty. The palace would issue a formal statement supporting him and condemning the racist abuse he had endured. As Daniel left the meeting, still processing what had happened, his phone buzzed with a message from his commanding officer. "Press conference at 1400 hours. Smart dress, you'll be speaking." For Thomas Wilson, the morning brought a different kind of reckoning. He checked out of his hotel and headed to the train station for the journey back to Manchester. While waiting on the platform, he noticed people looking at him, then quickly looking away. A few were more obvious, whispering to each other and glancing in his direction. It shouldn't have been surprising. His face had been all over social media and even the morning news. He was recognizable, especially here in London where it had all happened. A young man in a business suit approached him, phone in hand. "Excuse me, aren't you the guy from the palace?" "The one who, yeah, that's me." Thomas cut him off, bracing for more public shame. "Look, I know what I did was wrong, and Can I show you something?" The young man interrupted, holding out his phone. On the screen was a social media post. Someone had recognized Thomas from the videos and posted his full name, hometown, and workplace. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "They can't do that, can they?" he asked, although he knew the answer. "In the age of social media, anonymity disappeared in an instant." "It's already out there," the young man said, not unkindly. Thought you should know. As Thomas boarded the train to Manchester, he realized that the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. His moment of drunken prejudice would follow him home, to his workplace, to every aspect of his life. There would be no easy escape, no quick forgiveness. Meanwhile, across London, Sergeant Daniel Okonkwo stood before a room full of journalists, television cameras, and photographers. The flashbulbs were blinding, the questions coming from every direction. But he stood tall, his uniform perfectly pressed, his voice steady as he explained why, after years of silent discipline, he had chosen to speak. The uniform I wear represents centuries of service and sacrifice by people of all backgrounds, he said into the forest of microphones. When faced with that moment, I felt that silence would dishonor that legacy. I spoke not just for myself, but for every soldier who has ever stood in my position, for everyone who has ever served this country with pride regardless of their color or origin. As cameras clicked and reporters scribbled notes, neither Daniel nor Thomas could have imagined how their brief encounter would continue to reshape their lives, and perhaps something larger than themselves, in the days ahead. A week after the incident, the story showed no signs of fading from public attention. If anything, it had grown into something larger, a moment that seemed to capture both the worst and the best of modern Britain. Daniel's press conference had been broadcast live on every major news channel. Clips of his measured, thoughtful responses circulated widely online, drawing praise from public figures across the political spectrum. When asked if he wanted Thomas Wilson to face charges, his answer surprised many. "This isn't about punishment," he had said. "It's about understanding. If Mr. Wilson is willing to learn from this experience, that would be a more meaningful outcome than any legal penalty." Those words resonated deeply, sparking discussions in homes, workplaces, and classrooms across the country. A photo of Daniel in his ceremonial uniform became an iconic image, appearing on magazine covers and even street art in London neighborhoods. For Daniel himself, the attention was both overwhelming and surreal. He had never sought the spotlight. His choice of career in the Queen's Guard reflected his preference for discipline and service over recognition. Now he found himself thrust into a public role he hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. On a rainy Thursday morning, he sat in the office of Lieutenant Colonel James Hartford, head of public relations for the London district. Across from him was a woman in a navy blue suit who had been introduced as Diane Powell from the Department for Education. "We've received over 200 requests for you to speak at schools," Lieutenant Colonel Hartford explained, gesturing to a thick folder on his desk. "Everyone from primary schools to universities wants to hear from you." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, I'm a soldier, not a public speaker." "You're both now," Hartford replied. "Like it or not, Sergeant, you've become a symbol of something important to a lot of people." Diane Powell nodded in agreement. "The Department for Education is developing new anti-racism resources for schools. We'd like you to be involved, not just as a speaker but as a consultant on the content." Daniel looked between them, feeling unprepared for this turn of events. Surely there are people better qualified, educators, experts on these issues. "There are many experts," Powell acknowledged. "But right now, you're the one people are listening to. Your words reached people who might never have engaged with these issues before." Daniel thought about this. He had joined the military to serve his country. Perhaps this was simply a different form of service than he had anticipated. "I'd need guidance," he said finally. "I want to make sure I'm saying the right things." Hartford smiled. "That's exactly why you're the right person for this, Okonkwo. You understand the responsibility of your words." As they discussed the details, Daniel's phone vibrated with a message. It was from an unfamiliar number, and the contents made him pause. "Sergeant Okonkwo, my name is Thomas Wilson. I know you have no reason to speak to me, but I'm asking for the chance to apologize in person. I understand if you refuse." Daniel stared at the message for a long moment. He hadn't expected this. Meanwhile, in Manchester, Thomas was facing the consequences of his actions on multiple fronts. The day after his return, he'd been called into a meeting with his company's HR director and managing director. The conversation had been brief and to the point. His behavior had brought the company into disrepute, violated their code of conduct, and left them no choice but to terminate his employment. Thomas hadn't argued. He'd signed the paperwork, cleaned out his desk under the watchful eyes of security, and walked out past coworkers who either stared openly or carefully avoided looking at him. At home, things weren't much better. Louise had listened to his explanation, his apologies, his promises to do better, but something had changed between them. She was polite but distant, going through the motions of their shared life, while clearly reassessing everything about their relationship. "I don't even know who you are anymore," she had said on his third night home, after he'd had a few drinks and tried to tell her it would all blow over soon. "The man I married wouldn't have done what you did, wouldn't have said those things. People make mistakes," Thomas had argued weakly. Louise had looked at him then with an expression he'd never seen before. "There's a difference between a mistake and revealing who you really are." That conversation had been a turning point. The next morning, Thomas had woken up on the sofa, head pounding, and realized he was genuinely at risk of losing everything that mattered to him. His job was already gone. His marriage was hanging by a thread. His reputation was destroyed. He'd spent the day thinking harder than he had in years. About his life. About the resentment that had been building inside him. About the casual prejudices he'd absorbed without questioning. By evening, he'd made a decision that surprised even himself. He needed to try to make amends. Not just to save his marriage or his reputation, but because it was the right thing to do. Finding Sergeant Okonkwo's contact information hadn't been easy, but Thomas had been persistent. A friend of a friend who worked for a veterans charity had finally provided a number that might reach him. Now, having sent the message, Thomas waited anxiously for a response that might never come. He had no right to expect forgiveness, he knew that, but he hoped for the chance to at least express his genuine remorse. The reply, when it came, was characteristically direct. "Mr. Wilson, I appreciate your message. I'll be in Manchester next Tuesday for a speaking engagement. We could meet at 4 p.m. at the Central Library Cafe if that works for you." Thomas read the message several times, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over him. He had been given the opportunity he'd asked for. Now he needed to find the right words. Words that would express genuine remorse without making excuses. Words that would acknowledge the harm he'd caused without centering his own feelings. Over the next 5 days, both men prepared for their meeting in different ways. Daniel continued his regular duties with the Queen's Guard, while also meeting with military officials and education representatives to discuss his new role. The palace had issued a formal statement supporting him and condemning racism in all forms. His regiment had begun reviewing its protocols for guards facing abuse or harassment while on duty. Thomas, meanwhile, had started attending counseling sessions at a community center near his home. The counselor, a middle-aged man named Alan who had seen the news and recognized Thomas immediately, had been surprisingly non-judgmental. "You're here because you want to change," Alan had said in their first session. That's a start. In those sessions, Thomas began to unpack years of built-up resentment and misdirected anger. He talked about his father, a factory worker who had lost his job in the 1990s and never quite recovered, who had taught him that there was always someone to blame for life's disappointments. He talked about his own career frustrations, his fears about the future, his sense that the world was changing too fast and leaving men like him behind. "None of that justifies what I did," Thomas said in their third session. "I know that." "No, it doesn't," Alan agreed. "But understanding where these attitudes came from is the first step to changing them." By the day of the meeting, Thomas had drafted and discarded dozens of versions of what he wanted to say. In the end, he decided that the most honest approach would be the best one, to speak from the heart rather than from a prepared script. The Central Library Cafe was busy when Thomas arrived, 15 minutes early. He chose a table in the corner, ordered a coffee he couldn't drink, and waited nervously. A few people looked at him with the now familiar glance of recognition, but no one approached him. At exactly 4 p.m., Sergeant Daniel Okonkwo walked in, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple blue button-down shirt. Without the ceremonial uniform, he looked younger, though his military bearing was still evident in his posture and the way he scanned the room before spotting Thomas. Thomas stood up, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been dreading and hoping for, the chance to face the man he had wronged and take responsibility for his actions. Daniel approached the table with a neutral expression. "Mr. Wilson," he said, extending his hand. Thomas shook it, noting the firm grip. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice slightly hoarse with nervousness. I wasn't sure you would. They sat down, an awkward silence falling between them. Around them, the cafe buzzed with afternoon conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine providing a backdrop to this unlikely meeting. "I've been thinking about what to say to you," Thomas began. "I've written and rewritten it in my head 100 times, but nothing seems adequate." Daniel nodded but didn't interrupt. "What I did was inexcusable," Thomas continued. "The things I said to you, they were vile. And they don't represent who I want to be." He took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm truly sorry, and I'm trying to understand why I did what I did so I never repeat it." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "Why did you do it?" he asked finally. It was a simple question, but it cut to the heart of everything. Thomas had asked himself the same thing countless times over the past week. "I was drunk," he said, then immediately shook his head. "No, that's an excuse. The alcohol just brought out what was already inside me." He looked directly at Daniel for the first time. "I was angry about my own life and looking for someone to blame. You were just there, doing your job with dignity while I was falling apart." As their conversation continued, neither man noticed that they had drawn attention from other cafe patrons, nor did they see the person discreetly taking photos with a phone from several tables away, photos that would soon add another dimension to a story that was already changing both their lives in ways they could not have imagined. 3 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, the photos of Thomas and Daniel sitting together in the Manchester cafe had become almost as famous as the original video. The images had spread rapidly online, accompanied by headlines like "Reconciliation" and "The Conversation That Needed to Happen." What most people didn't know was what had actually been said during that meeting. The raw, honest exchange that had lasted nearly 2 hours and ended with something neither man had expected: a fragile beginning of understanding. On a crisp autumn morning, Daniel stood at the front of a classroom in a London secondary school. 30 teenagers watched him with varying degrees of interest as he finished his presentation. He had done this 12 times now in different schools across the country, but it still felt strange to be teaching rather than guarding. "The hardest part wasn't standing up to someone who insulted me," he explained, answering a student's question. "It was breaking the tradition of silence I had been trained to maintain. Sometimes doing the right thing means changing the rules, not just following them." A girl in the back row raised her hand. "Did you ever think you'd become famous for this?" Daniel smiled and shook his head. "Not for a moment. I was just doing what felt right at the time." "And what about that guy?" asked another student. "The one who was racist to you? Did he ever apologize?" Daniel paused, considering how much to share. "Yes, he did. We've actually met several times since then." This caused a stir in the classroom. Most people knew about the cafe meeting from the photos, but not about any further contact between the two men. "He's working to understand why he did what he did and how to be better," Daniel continued. "That's all any of us can do when we make mistakes. Try to learn from them." After the session ended, the school's head teacher approached Daniel as he gathered his materials. "That was excellent, Sergeant Okonkwo," she said warmly. "The students were really engaged. Especially when you talked about your meetings with Mr. Wilson." Daniel nodded. "I find it's the part of the story that surprises people the most." "Will you be seeing him again soon?" she asked. "Actually, yes. We're speaking together at an event next week." The event she had referred to was organized by the Ministry of Defense in partnership with several community organizations. It was part of a new initiative focusing on addressing racism within British institutions and society more broadly. Daniel had been asked to participate months ago. Inviting Thomas to join him had been his own idea, one that had raised eyebrows among the organizers but ultimately been approved. 200 miles away, in Manchester, Thomas sat in Alan's office for what would be their final counseling session. Over the past 3 months, these weekly meetings had become an essential part of his journey toward understanding and changing himself. "How are you feeling about next week's event?" Alan asked. Thomas exhaled slowly. "Terrified, if I'm being honest. Speaking in front of all those people, telling them about the worst thing I've ever done, and yet you agreed to do it." "I need to," Thomas said simply. "It's part of making amends, not just to Daniel but to everyone affected by what I did." Alan nodded. "You've come a long way since our first session." Thomas thought about that first meeting, how defensive he had been, how focused on the consequences to his own life rather than the harm he had caused. The journey hadn't been easy. He had lost his job. His marriage was still a work in progress, though Louise had begun to soften as she saw the genuine changes in him. Some friends had disappeared from his life entirely, but there had been unexpected developments too. After months of unsuccessful job hunting, Thomas had found work with a community organization focused on addressing prejudice and discrimination. His role was modest, mostly administrative support, but it gave him purpose and a path forward. "I still have bad days," he admitted to Alan, "times when I slip into old ways of thinking." "That's normal," Alan assured him. "Change isn't a straight line. The important thing is that you catch yourself and correct course." Thomas nodded, remembering something Daniel had said during their second meeting. "The goal isn't to become perfect. It's to become better than you were yesterday." The day of the event arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that sometimes graces London in late autumn. The venue was a converted warehouse in the East End, now a modern conference center with high ceilings and exposed brick walls. By mid-afternoon, all 300 seats were filled with an audience that included military personnel, government officials, community leaders, and media representatives. Daniel and Thomas met in a small room backstage. It was the 5th time they had seen each other face to face, yet there was still an initial awkwardness between them. Not hostility, but the natural tension of two people connected by an extraordinary circumstance rather than natural affinity. "How are you holding up?" Daniel asked, noticing the sheen of sweat on Thomas's forehead. "I've been better," Thomas admitted with a weak smile. "Public speaking isn't exactly my strong suit. Just speak honestly," Daniel advised. "That's all anyone can ask." A young woman with a clipboard appeared at the door. "5 minutes, gentlemen." As she left, Thomas turned to Daniel with sudden seriousness. "I need to ask you something." Daniel raised an eyebrow in question. "Are we doing this for the right reasons?" Thomas asked. "Or has this whole thing just turned into some kind of, I don't know, performance?" It was a question Daniel had asked himself many times over the past months. His face in the papers, his words quoted in Parliament, his story referenced in discussions about policy changes. There had been moments when it all felt surreal, disconnected from the actual events that had set everything in motion. "I think our reasons matter less than the impact," he said after a moment's thought. "If sharing our story helps other people reflect on their own attitudes and behaviors, then it's worth doing. Whatever brought us to this point." Thomas nodded slowly. "I just don't want to pretend we're friends now, or that what happened can be wrapped up in a neat, happy ending." "That's not what we're here to do," Daniel assured him. "We're here to show that change is possible, but it's complicated and difficult." "That seems honest enough to me." They walked onto the stage together a few minutes later, greeted by polite applause. The format was simple. Each would speak briefly about his experience, followed by a moderated conversation and questions from the audience. Daniel went first, telling the now familiar story from his perspective, the years of training to maintain composure under all circumstances, the split-second decision to break protocol, the aftermath that had transformed his life and career. He spoke without notes, his natural dignity and thoughtfulness evident in every word. When it was Thomas's turn, he approached the microphone with visible nervousness. He had prepared remarks, but as he looked out at the audience, he set the paper aside. "Most stories have heroes and villains," he began, his voice slightly unsteady. "In this one, it's pretty clear which one I am. 3 months ago, I did something inexcusable. I hurled racist abuse at a man who was simply doing his job with honor and professionalism." The room was completely silent as Thomas continued, detailing not just what he had done, but the journey he had undertaken since. The pain fee,